So I was saying this is a non-traditional research presentation, and hopefully by the time I've gone through to the end of this presentation, you'll have a different idea of how to look at equality and diversity in an interesting way. So in light of this, I'm going to be talking about intersectionality through the mode of storytelling, and in particular, narrative has formed a huge part of my research, my PhD research, but also in just the way I make sense of experiences generally. And I feel there's an empowerment to using stories to illustrate equality and diversity issues, which I'll illustrate through personal stories and through research stories as well. But just to give a brief introduction of who I am, so you know my position. So I'm Arun Verma, as Susie kindly introduced, and I identify as a gay man of colour and a feminist. And this is my perspective and something that I'm going to share with you through this journey on this presentation as well. And I thought it was quite important to kind of share my position, particularly surrounding LGBT History Month as well, so why not come out again? So intersectionality, one of the reasons why I'm mainly talking about this is because it's a really important way to frame equality and diversity issues, and it's been commonly used as a buzzword quite often in healthcare education and more broadly in the equality and diversity world as well. But before we kind of get into the crux and the core of intersectionality in terms of the literature, I want to start showing you or sensitising you to some of the issues of intersectionality by sharing with you a story. And I actually want to share my intersectionality story. So when I was putting this presentation together, I thought it would be quite interesting to look at what has my intersectionality journey been in myself. And if we're going to start using this in healthcare education policy and practice, perhaps we could start looking at our own intersectional selves and seeing how that goes. So I'll explain some of the key words as we go along, but this is just to kind of start thinking about some of the issues as well. So, I started off as a baby, not a cartoon baby, but this is all I could find at the time. For some reason, my parents don't have baby pictures of myself. I don't know what that's about, but that's the way it is. But I had some identities. So I was male, I was born a male, or a man. I was born in London, so that made me a British citizen. And my parents are Indian, so I was of Indian ethnicity as well. And I identify that being gay was something that I could always remember, so I've put that identity here as well, too. And I was an infant, so being an infant identity was cuddled, I had quite good family support, was fed. It's rather enjoyable, might be nice to go back maybe. But these are some of the identities that I kind of identified when I was a baby. And you'll note that I've put a star next to the identities that have changed, and I'll show how these have changed over time. So as I grew up, I became a child, obviously, and I developed more identities. I started to develop cultural identities. I started to learn how to speak Punjabi and Hindi and English, and those were kind of reflective of the languages that my parents spoke. I also went to a Christian Church of England school during the daytime, where my parents were Hindu. So there was huge conflict there, because during the daytime, Christians said don't start fires generally, because it's not a good thing to do. But at night time, in Hinduism, you tend to start fires as a way of connecting with God. So there's just all these kind of different ways of practicing different religions, and those kind of negotiations between identities there. And my parents were working class as well, so a lot of my time outside of school was spent in my parents' shop helping them. And it kind of dawned on me when I was putting this journey together that all of these identities were shaping my experience of that time, and were kind of interplaying with how I was making sense of things as well. But then something else happened, and I came into a teenager, and my identities changed again. So it's quite interesting. I started to develop student identity because I was in school, I was learning. I was also, although I identified as gay, I still hadn't come out, so there's some kind of internal conflict there as well. And that was quite an interesting time because I attempted a heterosexual relationship very briefly during that time because I thought that was the kind of norm, or what we might think of as the heteronormative as well. So these identities again started to change over time and started to kind of conflict with another in some way. What was really interesting during this time is I had my first experience of being subject to racism. And when I was putting this intersectionality narrative together, it kind of made me realise that in some contexts, my British, Indian and English identities put me in a vulnerable position in some places. And so that opened me up to an inequality of some sort. And I'll come back to more of these issues later on as well. However, things, again, so here I am now as an adult, and I don't know if you've noticed, but my male, British, Indian and gay identities haven't changed at all over time. They're the ones that have persisted, except that I've come out now, so that's kind of over and done with, so to speak. But I've also developed more stronger professional identities, so being a researcher and a psychologist. However, there's also been some conflict there, because in some contexts, I've shied away from expressing my gay identity in certain professional environments due to a fear of coming out. But interestingly, having these multiple identities opened me up to a very interesting inequality that I didn't think I'd ever experience. And this was being subject to racism within the LGBT community. And that was kind of made me realise I became a minority within a minority group. And it opened me up to a very unique experience of what being gay was. And so that was quite interesting, understanding how British, Indian, gay and English identities didn't always work together for some people, and it opened me up to some vulnerabilities there as well. So I shared that story to kind of get thinking about those of my identities and how they've changed over time, and perhaps this is something that we could all do as well, thinking about our own intersectionalities in some way. However, we all like a nice definition of these kind of abstract concepts, of course. And the questions around intersectionality and buzzwords is, what is intersectionality? What does it mean? Why is it important? And why is it so kind of pervasive at the moment in equality and diversity talk? Well, the first thing is that intersectionality isn't a definition. It's what Kimberly Crenshaw, who's one of the pioneers of the method, she argues intersectionality is a frame on equality and diversity. It's a way in which we look at things to make sense of something. And that's kind of what I've done with my intersectionality journeys. I've applied that frame to understand my identities over time. And that's how we might look at equality and diversity in healthcare education and workplace learning as well. But I couldn't help myself but provide some sort of textual definition. So I came up with this based on the literature, which is that intersectionality is a frame on equality and diversity and argues that our multiple identities shape our lived experiences of inequality and social injustices. So it gives a rough explanation of what intersectionality is in text form. But again, it's really kind of understanding that it's a frame, it's a lens, it's a way of looking at things, rather than just having something, a paragraph on a piece of paper. So during, when I was doing some research for this particular presentation, I watched a TED Talk with Kimberly Crenshaw, who talks about the urgency of intersectionality, and she was one of the pioneers of this particular theory. And she did this really interesting activity, which I've kind of tried to see if it works today, if we can adapt it. And essentially, this is just to kind of illustrate and maybe to start thinking about reflecting on our own intersectionality and how we see things. So what I'm going to do on the next two slides is I'm going to put some names up on the slide, and I would like for you, if you're able to raise your hands if you recognise most of the names on the slide. And then I'm going to take like a brief count in my head. So is that okay with everyone? Okay, great. So if you recognise the names, then raise your hand. Okay, great. And then if you can, well, it seems to be everyone, I think. Found about. And then if you know the connection, or you think you might know the connection between these names, you can lower your hand. Sorry, there's not a test, honestly. Okay. So that was pretty much, everyone kind of recognised the names, and about half didn't recognise the connection, but that's okay. Okay, so I'm going to do this exercise again, but with a different set of names. So if you can raise your hand if you recognise any of these names. Okay. And again, for those who had their hands up, if you want to lower, if you recognise the connection perhaps between these names. Okay, so what's interesting from the count here is that most people recognise the names on the first slide than on the second. And let me explain the connection. All of these women are famous female celebrities that have reported being sexually assaulted or subject to gender discrimination, harassment, etc. But what's evident from this exercise, and I did this as well when I was putting this activity together, is that we recognise more of the white female celebrity names than we do of the black and Asian female celebrity names. And it's quite interesting because when I put this together, I actually had to look up who Cady and Noble was and who Ava DuVernay was as well. And I was thinking, these are really famous people, but why do we not recognise them in a more popular way? And it kind of raised some important issues and questions. Is it the media? Is it the way they're reported? What's going on here? But we know there's something maybe around the intersection of gender and ethnicity. So Jane Fonda highlighted this intersectionality issue quite nicely. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Harvey Weinstein kind of scandal that's going on at the moment. He's been accused by many women for sexual assault, harassment, etc. But Jane Fonda, a white woman, really kind of captures this intersectionality issue and says that accusers are getting attention because they're white and famous. And then she goes on to say that women of colour have made similar accusations for years. And what essentially she's doing is she's utilising that intersectionality frame to address this issue of equality and diversity in the media. Ava DuVernay also draws on this power imbalance, and she actually explicitly calls for white women to support women of colour who haven't received such support. Because again, using that frame of intersectionality, the experience changes, our understanding of equality, inequalities and diversity changes. Now, what's interesting about people like Jane Fonda and Ava DuVernay is that they're highlighting an issue of intersectionality, and in the sense they're basically saying that the experience of assault and discrimination for white women changes when you take in contrast to black women as well. And in this particular context, we see that white men are there's a power difference and power imbalance between the white female celebrities and the black female celebrities in terms of recognition and support. And this is what intersectionality does. It goes into more depth and unpacks these identities in a more intricate way to understand what's actually going on here. Now, I've talked a lot about kind of identity this, identity that, and identities, particularly for this presentation, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the research I've done as well shortly, identities are fluid, they adapt. You might remember from my own personal story that my identity's changed over my life course and changed in relation to the context I was in. So after a while, so I wasn't always a Christian, I was only a Christian at school, but after I left school, that identity sort of diminished, essentially. So this argument that identities are adaptive, they change with the context, they're fluid, and they change over time, is kind of the premise of what identities are. Now, when we look at intersectionality in more depth, most people might consider, or some people might consider any gender as their only identity. And if we look at literature, or historic literature, typically we see a lot around gender differences and just gender being the sole focus on identities. But intersectionality argues that we have multiple identities, and these are kind of age, class, sexuality, disability, etc. And these all shape the experiences of the individual. But when we start looking at the multiple identities and how they intersect, we then start to understand different types of inequalities and how those intersect as well. So as we saw from the examples of the black female celebrities, they're subject to some form of racism and sexism at the same time, and that's kind of giving some more insight to their experience of harassment as well. But what's interesting here as well, that this also changes when we start to look at the professional identities. And by professional identities, particularly in healthcare, we think of these as, say, doctor, nurse, physiotherapist, dentist, consultant, surgeon, etc. And what's interesting is when we start to look at the personal identities and the professional identities and how they intersect with one another, things change, and we start to see some identities, like gender, for example, overpowering the professional self. And there's tons of cases around discrimination in healthcare education policy, education practice, and we see that in the workforce and also in the literature too. So what does that mean for healthcare education and workplace learning and such? So intersectionality, as I've described, is hopefully giving you a grasp of what it is and why it's important, but how does it relate to the healthcare education and healthcare setting? Well, we know that intersectionality is a key buzzword at the moment in healthcare education. It's been talked about quite a lot in the media, and also in terms of literature and academic literature as well. These are some of the headlines taken from the last 1 to 2 years. And we can just see the diversity of inequalities that kind of are being reported on quite a lot of. And there's this one headline about calling for intersectionality in certain healthcare settings and homophobia and etc. So there's still kind of key issues of inequality happening in the healthcare context. And intersectionality is one way to kind of bring that all together. But we also know that inequalities of individuals shapes their retention success as well. And some of those reports as well talk about unfair kind of some inequalities that are experienced by individuals having an impact on their career choices, where they see themselves in the future, and also their success and how well they perform in their workplace learning. And this can change over time as well too. So in relation to kind of some of these issues, my PhD research was looking at longitudinal audio diaries of medical and nursing students across the UK. And in particular, I recruited initially 36 participants to be involved with the study, and 14 of those participants were included as full case studies, essentially. And these 14 participants attended entrance interviews, submitted regular audio diaries, and exit interviews as well. When I talk about audio diaries, these were kind of essentially participants that recorded on their phone and emailed their data files to me on a regular basis over a period of months, over different placements. And essentially what I did with these cases, I did a case study analysis looking at the 14 participants' journeys and their experiences across time. And I was particularly interested in their experiences of male and female dominated and gendered environments as well. So with regards to analysis, I used a mixture of narrative and sociolinguistic and positioning analysis, which I'm happy to talk about after the presentation, but I won't go into too much depth here. And what I did was essentially conducted what I kind of like to call an intimate examination of the data itself. And I was able to do that with a smaller sample and a much closer examination as well of cases. I don't think doing this level of analysis on more than 14 would have been doable within the time I had for my PhD thesis. And I'm deliberately focusing on these particular case studies because this is where I did analysed most of the identity work as well, and which I'll present shortly. So I'm going to talk about one particular case study journey, which was Amanda. This is a pseudonym. And she identified as a white female bisexual medical student, aged between 17 to 25. And she was in the clinical years of her training at the time of the study. The clinical years being years 3 to 5 in this particular institution. And I've chosen this particular case study because Amanda talked quite heavily about her intersecting personal and professional identities and how they shaped her experiences as well. So when I was looking at the case studies in more depth, I was particularly interested in the way in which Amanda talked and narrated her stories. I was really interested in her intersecting identities and how they shaped her experiences and her retention success. I was also quite interested in the workplace relationships that she formed during these placements too, and also the gendered environments. How did she construct those? I mean, after doing this case study analysis, just to give some context as well, was done after a thematic analysis was conducted across all of the data. And so really these case studies were about understanding how these particular themes played out over time for these participants. So I'm going to share some of the data and just kind of talk through some of the analysis so you kind of get an idea of what intersectionality looks like in action. So in terms of Amanda's narrative style, she used politeness forms. So she was very polite. She gave lots of information, that this is my recording, gave dates, etc. She thanked me, or she said thank you at the end of her recordings quite often. And she also used a lot of feeling words, and she also used a lot of feeling words. Now these kind of feeling type narratives and this politeness from the sociolinguistics literature is typically reflective of her female gendered identity, shaping how she narrates. I say that cautiously, though, to avoid perpetuating any stereotypes. That's something from the literature as well. So we know already that she's got her female identity is kind of coming through in a nuanced way in the way in which she talks. And this is the politeness and her feeling type narratives. In terms of her intersecting identities, she was quite interesting to listen to in terms of audio diaries. Particularly, she described herself as not really being a feminine woman, and I would separate femininity and womanhood into two identities themselves. And she narrates a sort of tension between her gendered identities. She then also talks about this kind of this tension between her personal and professional identities. And she says here, I'm definitely very interested in psychiatry and GP. I'm not against the idea of raising a family. It does make me a bit worried if I do start going into GP or psychiatry, and at some point my fellow female colleagues do just start to leave to raise a family. So here we kind of see some of her fears and concerns around the genderscape of GP and psychiatry and a career there as well, in terms of potentially her colleagues, her female colleagues, leaving her at some point. So there's some sort of retention issues being discussed there, perhaps. In terms of her workplace relationships, she was quite clear and explicit in talking about discriminative talk towards her. And in particular, she talked about receiving unsolicited career advice from male doctors quite often in her placements. So, for example, male doctors would say, if you're wanting to have a family, they say looking at Amanda, the female medical student, then this is a good specialty. And she was subject to that. She narrated those kind of instances quite often, which is, again, reflective of her female identity and her professional identity being in conflict with one another. There's also this other instance that she talks about where she says she had a teaching with a male consultant. There was one point where she felt a bit uncomfortable because he was demonstrating a clinical skill, but was quite close and did get quite into her personal space during a section of the session. He was just close enough to notice, which he didn't do with the male student. It was a bit distracting. And here she's kind of narrating sort of maybe an overstep of the boundary, and the way in which she's reporting this particular male consultant is maybe just overstepping the mark in terms of personal space. And she really kind of emphasises that by saying, well, he didn't do that with the male students, he did it with me as a female. So we start to see these kind of intersections of personal and professional coming into play in these workplace relationships too. In terms of the gendered environments, the participants were typically asked what they thought were male and female dominated environments, and they were quite explicit in stating certain contexts were male dominated, like surgery was probably one of the most popular ones, and obstetrics gynecology being also probably a more female dominated context as well. But Amanda's really interesting in the sense that she talks quite sophisticatedly about gender in the clinical workplace. And she says, it does make me wonder whether there's something that pits off women from going into neurology, whether it's because it's more male-dominated and therefore women feel more threatened or isolated. And whether she's trying to make sense of why these gendered environments are kind of deterring certain genders from these specialties. She also narrates some resistance to some of these gendered environments as well, though. Particularly, she says it bugs her a bit when any particular specialty is being viewed as a woman's specialty or a male specialty through the virtue of their gender as opposed to their merits. So again, she's kind of annoyed, I guess, in that sense, of why these male and female-dominated environments exist. And is it because of their gender or is it because of professional merit? And what's kind of going on there? That's something we can unpack, perhaps. But again, we start to see more of this intersectionality between the personal and the professional coming through in Amanda's talk. Just to kind of give a broad summary of some of the case studies, of all the case studies in general that were analysed, generally over time we saw that tensions in the intersecting personal and professional identities did change over time. And more importantly, staff had a pivotal impact on students' workplace learning experiences. And you can see that from some of the reports of the discriminative talk and some of the instances I've shown already. And the resistance to negative experiences did change over time, but these were much more commonly found in gender discordant, so for example, females in male-dominated environments, and those kinds of placements, where we saw the resistance. On a positive note, because it's not all negative, Amanda, for example, had a prior interest in GP and psychiatry, and that didn't change over time. So what was quite interesting, the participants that did express an interest in a particular specialty, despite their inequalities that they narrated, it seemed like they would typically stay with those specialties for the participants on this study. And on also a good note, none of the participants decided or had any thoughts about quitting the profession at all. So there may be something to be said about the participants in this particular study having a very strong commitment to the profession, but maybe less so for certain specialties for their future. So given that this is the LGBT History Month themed talk, I found a really kind of nice narrative of Amanda's talking about her bisexuality in relation to her workplace learning and how it's almost enabled her to engage in the learning and maybe enhance her success in some way. So I'll briefly read this out. And she says, I'm someone who identifies as bisexual. I'm aware of quite a lot of LGBT issues, and there was a slightly awkward and confused moment when we were talking about a patient who was an MSM patient, so a man who had sex with a man. I'm familiar with this terminology and with many ways in which people define themselves on the spectrum of being gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, queer, etc. The consultant just casually dropped in, this is a young male with a risk factor of being MSM. So this is about the patient. I nodded and the other student was quite confused. He did afterwards just check with me saying, I wasn't quite sure what had happened there. What did the consultant say? So I just took him through some of the LGBT plus terminology, and it just made me think about the way I see myself as a bisexual, who even if we're not that deeply entrenched in any of these LGBT communities, still try to keep an idea of how people talk about things and the terminology that gets used. Maybe it would be a good idea to have a few more opportunities throughout the course to widen their awareness and widen their vocabularies so that when something LGBT plus related comes up, or when a patient defines themselves in a particular way, you don't have to go, I'm sorry, but I don't know what you mean by that. So I found this really interesting because Amanda was able to kind of engage more, particularly in this in the patient's language, because she herself identified as bisexual, and she describes being a bit more sensitized to some of the language of LGBT plus communities. And in that way, she's been able to use that to kind of enhance her workplace learning and engage with the teaching better in some ways. However, this raises an issue about other participants or other students maybe who aren't so familiar with this language and how we might address that as well in terms of broader healthcare education too. So this is kind of really just capturing that kind of link between her intersecting sexual state identities and her professional identities as well. So hopefully you've kind of got a snapshot of the complexities around intersectionality, retention, success, and workplace learning. It's a bit of a jumbled mess, I think, when it comes to equality and diversity, but it's definitely something that can be explored through the intersectionality frame and start to unpick those issues a little bit more depth. But, I mean, what does this mean for healthcare education practice? So some of the kind of key discussion points from my PhD research was that the inconsistencies of support that the participants had during their workplace placements, workplace learning placements even, were not always consistent, and this may mean that they didn't have those reflective spaces to talk about their identities as such. Now, one of the limitations of this particular research is that I asked the participants to explicitly think about their identities and their retention and success. But at the same time, they were openly willing to talk about that, and they had quite a lot to say when you asked them the question. So perhaps these are things that could be integrated into workplace learning in the clinical context for students to kind of make sense of their personal and professional identities during their workplace learning. In terms of trying to get more intersectionality and equality and diversity into policy, this is kind of a big challenge. In a lot of policy at the moment, you see this kind of paragraph definition of intersectionality, and then it just kind of ends there. And maybe we need to start thinking about diversifying who writes the policy, who gives feedback on the policies. Do we need more LGBT groups looking at these policies to make sure we haven't missed anything out and ensure that we're taking an intersectional approach to writing them and developing these issues as well? So briefly just say thank you to my supervisors, Lynn Monroe, Rola Jawi, Charlotte Rees and Susie Schofield for supervising the PhD project. Thank you to the Higher Education Academy for funding the project, who are very generous. And also to the participants on the School of Medicine, Centre for Medical Education, and obviously to the group, I don't know what the group is called, that invited me here, Ellie and Kevin, I think, as well. The LGBT group. Yeah, that was the champions, yeah. And hopefully this has just kind of given you a sense of different intersectionality issues, equality and diversity, from a personal and a professional point of view. And thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, does anyone from here and from Perth have any questions? If you put your hands up, I will be able to identify, and then someone can ask the question. Lynn?
Sorry, it's actually, I'm terrible, it's not really a question, but I, this week, did the Trust update my equality and diversity thing on the Trust thing, and actually, they've got as a question, if you ask somebody if they have a husband or a wife, what does that assume that you're assuming? And it says that you're assuming that they're straight. They've obviously not updated that since gay marriage was a thing. So even our equality and diversity training is really out of date.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose it could also depend on if you're looking at a female and you ask, do you have a husband? Or if you're looking at a male.
Yeah, I think it's just the way it's phrased.
Yeah.
I think it was written pre-change in the law, and it was interesting that that's like, can't get that bit right.
I guess also the Equality Act was only introduced in 2010, so maybe it's still quite young in terms of its application in some areas. I know there's certainly some older institutions that have still yet to include more gender-friendly categories as well, or boxes, I suppose.
Other comments or questions? Anything from Perth? I don't, yeah?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm wondering then, do you think so I trained part-time, and then so subsequently have sort of become an accidental proxy where other trainees email me sometimes to ask my advice about what it's like to train and have babies during training. And I'm wondering whether you were talking about saying certain specialties are easier than other, or vice versa, etc. Like, am I doing the wrong thing? I don't know. Am I doing the wrong thing, or are certain specialties easier or otherwise? I don't know. That's a bit difficult.
Yeah, I think
there are also realistic things about like night shifts and certain things that exist in certain specialties and don't in others and things. I don't know. It's quite hard. I'm now wondering whether
Well, one of the things that came up with the top participants was really interesting in the fact that just looking at the male participants and the female participants, it was only the female participants that talked about managing a family with their careers, and that didn't come up with any of the male participants in the study. And I found that I think it's more reflective of a cultural issue in the sense that how we're accommodating females in different specialties, and if there's enough support for them to have a career, and how do we divide the labour, I suppose, in that way. But I don't think you would have done anything wrong.
Just a wee question. So, Arun, with respect to your participants, would have imagined they were all probably within the same age range and relatively young. But I wonder if there were any older participants and whether there was anything different came through, with respect to intersectionality and age.
Yeah, so particularly with the nursing participants, they have seemed to have more age diversity in there, or from the participants that I had in my study. So a lot of the older nursing participants tended to, particularly older female nursing participants, were given more responsibility than they should have been on their workplace learning experiences, because they were deemed more resilient, more capable of dealing with certain work pressures. But contrastly, one young male participant, he grew a beard on a particular work placement, was also treated as a qualified doctor in some of his narratives because he had a beard. So that was quite... so that maybe there's a beard identity issue going on as well, I don't know. So, yeah, age.
I don't know if anyone heard the analysis programme on Radio 4 the other week. It's still up on iPlayer, and it was looking at unconscious bias, and it was looking at specifically at females having unconscious bias about gender. It's worth a listen. If the mix of people in this room, if the men are feeling a bit picked on sometimes with gender, and the women are feeling a bit smug, no, it doesn't work like that at all. Society as a whole is very gendered, and the unconscious bias going on does seem to affect all of us, and a lot of it is just being aware. So they were, one of them was telling something about in America, the research done looking at intersectionality. So women of colour were prescribed far fewer painkillers than the rest of society. I don't know if anyone else is aware of that research. Are we saying that women of colour don't feel pain as much? Or is there an unconscious, historical, totally unfounded bias going on? And that was certainly the suggestion. So the woman talking about this on radio, she was saying about, as a practical measure, it's no good just having unconscious bias training, although that's it's an interesting thing to do and to see. It tends then to sort of drift back to your unconscious bias again. And she was saying that what they really needed was for physicians to see the graph come up as soon as they were going to prescribe, just to remind them, to make them conscious each time. So I thought it was quite interesting. Another very quick little anecdote, I'm taking over here.
No. Well, it draws on with the...
It's like Lynn was saying about, how we don't always update our systems enough. Those of you who know me, that I have a very openly trans woman husband. And I say she's very open about it, because she never minds me using her as anecdotes. And children, on the other hand, they get a bit fed up with me. But my husband was fine about it, and she was having her, she'd gone to her endocrinologist, and the endo was saying, have you had your PSA tested? And she said, no. And the consultant said, you've got a prostate, haven't you? And she said, she's a bit intimidated. Yes. And so the consultant turned to her registrar and said, book her in for a PSA. And the computer says no. Because the computer said, female does not have a prostate. Does it in Scotland? This is down in Manchester. Does it say male does not need calling for a cervical smear? So you're right. We need to be checking our systems. I haven't asked my husband if she's managed to get a PSA test since, but we do have things built in. And having been a computer programmer, I can imagine I must have been very proud at that stage. Thinking, oh yeah, just have a little select, an else if going on, so that people didn't get asked unnecessary questions. But actually, there's a small minority that it hits really hard. And of course, a lot of people in the transgender society might actually not want to be reminded or remind the health service, actually, yeah, I've got a cervix, do I need a cervical smear? They might be a little bit shy about that, same with the PSA. Okay, so I've got interesting things to share. Okay, so Perth, talk to us. Wave to us, Perth. Check you can hear us. We'll wave. Okay, so if there's no more questions, thank you very much. And Purple Friday tomorrow. And Arun will be around for a little bit longer. Then he goes down to Surrey, where he's now mixing with Westminster MPs to inform policy. So, wow. No wonder he left Dundee. What did you say to him? You got off the train and said, "Oh, so nice to breathe clean air."
Yeah. I feel like my black lung is going in the 5 hours that I have here. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.